coming up, ramping up the pressure on Russia. The United States unveils new sanctions targeting a key commercial bank, oligarchs and a crypto mining company to close loopholes in existing sanctions against the Kremlin. This as Moscow claims to test a powerful nuclear-capable missile. With no end in sight for the war in Ukraine, Washington Defense Chief Lloyd Austin holds a rare phone call with his Chinese counterpart Wei Feng. This follows President Biden's warning to China not to give Moscow military or economic aid. South Korea continues to see daily COVID-19 cases on a downward trend. But in autumn, experts warned the country, along with the US and the UK, could see another resurgence.
Hello and welcome to our new day at Arirang. It's Thursday, April 21st, 8 a.m. here in Seoul, South Korea, and I'm Lee Seung-jae.
And I'm Woo Soo-young. Thank you as always for joining us this morning. Over the next hour, we'll be giving you a look at some of the top stories of the day and experts' insights on some of the biggest issues facing Korea and the rest of the world. Now, as Russia carries out a full-fledged offensive in eastern Ukraine, US State Secretary Antony Blinken warns that atrocities in Mariupol could actually be far worse than those seen in Bucha following Russia's withdrawal.
That's right, and he also underscored the need for continued US support for Kyiv. For this, Kim Yo-sun has more.
America's top diplomat has warned that he believes atrocities in Ukraine's port city of Mariupol will turn out to be, quote, far worse than in Bucha, where scores of civilians were found to have been tortured and killed following the withdrawal of Russian troops.
What the world witnessed just a couple of weeks ago, when the receding Russian tide from Bucha revealed what was left in its wake in terms of death, destruction, atrocities. We can only anticipate that this tide also at some point recedes from Mariupol. We're going to see far worse, if that's possible to imagine.
U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken also stressed that Washington is assisting by providing evaluation and assessments of the situation to the Ukrainian government. As fighting continues, the UN chief has requested a separate meeting with the presidents of Ukraine and Russia.
The Secretary General said at this time of great peril and consequence, he would like to discuss urgent steps to bring about peace in Ukraine and the future of multilateralism based on the Charter of the UN and international law.
Against his backdrop, the Kremlin says it's waiting for an answer from Ukraine after it submitted a draft document on negotiations. This comes amid increasing skepticism over whether Moscow is negotiating in good faith after the US and UK insisted that Russian forces were repositioning instead of scaling back from Ukraine. In related news, the US has imposed fresh sanctions on dozens of Russian individuals and entities. The new round of sanctions announced Wednesday targets a Russian commercial bank and a virtual currency mining company. Washington has also decided to impose visa restrictions on 635 Russian nationals who have been involved in activities that threaten the territorial integrity of Ukraine and have been involved in human rights abuses in the Donbas region of Ukraine. Kim Yo-sun, Arirang News.
Russia says it has successfully tested its new Sarmat intercontinental ballistic missile, reportedly capable of delivering warheads 2,000 times more powerful than the atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945. Following Wednesday's launch, Russian President Vladimir Putin said the long-awaited addition to its nuclear arsenal would make Moscow's enemies stop and think. Pundits say the test comes at a symbolic time, 8 weeks into the war in Ukraine and less than 3 weeks before Russia's annual Victory Day celebrations, which are marked by a parade where Moscow shows off its latest weapons.
Now, in the new time, U.S. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin spoke with his Chinese counterpart on Wednesday for the first time since becoming the Pentagon chief more than a year ago. Now, according to the Pentagon, the two discussed U.S.-China defense relations, regional security issues, and Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Now, the over-the-phone talks took place at Austin's request as U.S. officials are concerned China might provide military support for Russia's war in Ukraine. Now, the U.S. had initially requested talks with China's highest-ranking military officer. Now, South Korea is continuing to see a decline in daily COVID-19 figures. Now, as of 9 p.m. on Wednesday, 87,796 people saw new cases were reporting, a drop of more than 20,000 from the same time the day before. It's also the first time in 9 weeks that the daily tally has fallen below 100,000 for the same period. However, experts at the KDCA meeting on Wednesday warned of a potential resurgence in November, which could see the number of COVID-19 related deaths spike to the 2,700 range. Now, for the past couple of days, South Korea has seen this figure stay at the low hundreds. The experts said in order to prevent an autumn COVID-19 wave, people need to get their second booster shot. Now, international travel is revived as the world comes out of the pandemic, and that, of course, includes South Korea. Flight tickets, though, have gone way up. The key driving factors, not just the demand, but a spike in jet fuel prices. Yoon sheds light on this phenomenon.
If we look on a flight comparison website, flights to New York for next week cost 2,090,000 Korean won. That's roughly $1,700 US. This is a significant hike from the roughly $1,200 for the same route on March 11th, just before the lifting of the travel quarantine was announced. And before the COVID-19 pandemic, this same route was under $1,050. But with the latest rise in demand for overseas travel, such discounted prices are impossible to get. The outbreak of the war in Ukraine has caused a soar in international oil prices, which is reflected in airfare as well. For U.S. route flights for next month, Korean Air charges around $200 in fuel tax, and Asiana Airline charges $160, which is more than 3 times higher than it was in February 2021. Despite such rises, demand for travel is also on a sharp increase. Just a week before the quarantine exemption was announced, there were only some 675 sales of travel packages. But after the announcement, that number increased more than twofold in the space of a week and has increased roughly 20% every week since. In just 1 month, the number of travel package sales have increased 442%. Most of the demand is for flights to the U.S. or Europe, where much of the quarantine restrictions for arriving travelers have been lifted. Airlines have been working hard to increase the number of international flights in a rush to bring flights back to normal, but the number of flights are at a mere 12% compared to before the pandemic. Industry analysts expect this number to only rise to 50% by the end of the year, which means continued high demand for travel will keep discounted airfare scarce and prices will remain high for the time being. Yoon, Arirang News.
It's now time for On Point, where we speak to experts to delve deeper into the biggest news stories in the spotlight right now. With a decline in COVID-19 cases, not just here in South Korea, but throughout the world, hopes are high that we might be inching closer to finally overcoming the pandemic.
But with fears of new variants, concerns remain on how much more prolonged the pandemic could become. Now, to get a closer look at the global COVID-19 situation, we connect with Ben Cowling, Chair Professor of Epidemiology at the University of Hong Kong. Very good morning to you, Professor. It's lovely to see you again.
Good morning.
Right. Well, first off, Professor, are we seeing an overall downward trend in the number of global COVID-19 cases, or are there still parts of the world where it's pretty much a big concern?
Well, there are some parts of the world that are still dealing with COVID. Shanghai has been in the news, of course, but globally, the COVID deaths are actually the lowest they've been for the last 2 years, which is really good news. We know the case counts can go up and down for various reasons. Some countries are not counting as aggressively now as they have been in the past, but COVID deaths are still going to be fairly well documented. The fact those are really low right now is good news.
Now, I want to kind of go over to the African continent because Africa is actually seeing one of the longest running decline in COVID-19 numbers since the pandemic started. But we're looking at a place where they're reporting one of the lowest number of vaccination rates in the continent. How is that possible?
Well, we have to recognize that the immunity someone gets after an infection is quite comparable to the immunity they get after vaccination. The reason we prefer people to get vaccinated than infected is because infections can be dangerous, particularly in older people, people with underlying medical conditions. In Africa, COVID's had an enormous impact, but right now the levels of immunity are sky high because of the levels of infections that they've had in particularly in the past year. So I'm not surprised that the levels of incidence are low at the moment. When there's a new variant, we'll see. Remember, Omicron was first detected in South Africa, but there's a high level of immunity right now, not only in Africa, but in many parts of the world because of infections.
And Professor, the Southern Hemisphere is going to welcome the winter season soon. And of course, normally we see a higher risk of another wave of infections during the colder months. And well, how concerned should we be this time around?
So I think Australia and New Zealand are still dealing with their exit waves. So they're going to be very cautious this winter in their Southern Hemisphere. In South America and in southern parts of Africa, I'm not sure if they'll be so concerned anymore because, as we mentioned, there's a high level of immunity there, somewhat from vaccinations, but also to a great degree from infections. So I think we will see COVID resurge in the winter in the Southern Hemisphere, but it won't be much of a concern particularly for South America and for Southern Africa.
You know, one terminology that we haven't really been using quite often is the term herd immunity. Now, you know, so many people are catching Omicron that now they're saying, well, herd immunity could be potentially achieved. Is this possible right now globally?
Well, in Korea, you have herd immunity for Omicron BA2. The reason that your case counts are coming down, whereas they were going up just a few weeks ago, is because you've passed the herd immunity threshold. In other parts of the world, they've certainly passed the herd immunity threshold. But of course, it's not necessarily a permanent state. We know that immunity wanes over time. So somewhere that has herd immunity may not have it for a long time. And also when new variants emerge, as with Omicron, as with the next variant in the future, the immunity will be different. We have places like South Africa that had a very high level of immunity to Delta, but when Omicron came, it was able to get around that and the herd immunity is gone. So we have herd immunity now in many parts of the world, but it may not persist for a long time. We'll see what the virus does.
And well, Professor, that actually leads to our next question. So many are hoping that even if another variant emerges, that it will be weaker than the Omicron variant. Do you think that's a safe bet, or could it actually turn into a stronger variant like Delta?
I think it's a pretty safe bet that the next variants that emerge will not have as much impact as Delta did, as Omicron did. But that's not necessarily because the virus is weaker. If you look at Shanghai right now, Omicron can do a lot of damage. It can spread very, very quickly, and it can cause severe disease. In Hong Kong, we had more than 8,000 deaths in just 2 months with Omicron. So I think it's not necessarily the virus that changes, but the immunity that builds up in the population that means future variants will have less impact. That's good news, I think, in terms of the concern about pandemic, the concern about COVID. We don't need to be so worried looking to the future.
Certainly some pleasant news there, Professor Cowley. As always, thank you very much for your insight and looking forward to talking to you again.
Thank you.
President-elect Yoon Suk-yeol is on a 3-day tour of the southern part of the country, the focal point, deregulation, to attract more investment to these regions. On Wednesday, he was in South Korea's southwest Honam area. Yoon Jung-min takes us there.
Visiting the National Pension Service on Wednesday in Cheonju, Jeollabuk-do Province, President-elect Yoon Suk-yeol said his policies will focus on lifting as many regulations as possible to secure more investment. He also said that when companies prosper, there is a positive impact on their employees too.
누구든지 우리 국민이든 우리 기업이든 외국인이든 해외 기업이든 간에 우리나라에서 마음껏 돈 벌 수 있게 해준다. 그리고 저희는 세금만 받으면 되는 겁니다.
On his way to the region, Yoon took an aerial tour of Saemangum, a tidal flat where the world's biggest seawall has reclaimed a huge amount of land, which he said he will make an attractive area for businesses. He stressed the need to deregulate in the region, mentioning China's strategy of attracting foreign companies.
President-elect Yoon also visited a construction site in Gwangju for an artificial intelligence complex and pledged to help make the city a Korean version of Silicon Valley.
인재 양성과 R&D, 창업 지원을 위한 각종 세제와 법적, 제도적, 재정적 지원을 아끼지 않겠습니다.
Yoon also visited a number of industrial sites in Yeongam and yet again urged the need for deregulation, saying there are delays in securing foreign workers due to too much regulation. On Wednesday, the president-elect kicked off a 3-day tour to the south of the country in the Jeollado provinces and Gwangju, as well as Busan and Gyeongsang-namdo province. His spokesperson said the purpose of the trip is to fulfill his campaign pledge to revisit these areas and to look after the livelihoods of their people. Yoon's team dismissed claims that there is a political motivation ahead of the local elections in June. Last week, he visited the conservative strongholds of Daegu and Gyeongsang-bukdo. On Tuesday, the president-elect had dinner with U.S. nuclear envoy Sung Kim, who is visiting Seoul this week. But Yoon's spokesperson dismissed any diplomatic interpretations, saying it was only a private meeting organized by lawmaker Chung Jin-seok. Yoon Jung-min, Arirang News.
In the meantime, South Korea's foreign minister nominee Park Jin met with Washington's top nuclear envoy to discuss ways to coordinate on North Korea policies. Park said the new government will closely communicate and cooperate with the U.S. from day one to maintain the allies' watertight posture, as North Korea's latest missile launches pose a great threat to regional peace and stability. Now, agreeing with that, Sung Kim said the Biden administration looks forward to working with the Yoon administration and vowed to prioritize bilateral cooperation amid instability on the Korean Peninsula. Now, satellite imagery appears to show North Korea getting ready to put on a military parade, likely for its military founding anniversary. Now, often the regime uses these events to show off new strategic weapons, while Han Sung-woo provides a glimpse of what to expect.
North Korea, ahead of Monday's 90th anniversary of the founding of its People's Revolutionary Army, appears to be preparing for a large-scale military parade. Radio Free Asia reports that more than 12,000 troops gathered on Sunday at the parade training grounds at Mirim Airfield in eastern Pyongyang, citing satellite imagery provided by U.S.-based Planet Labs. The pictures showed the troops marching in formation along with scores of vehicles. The day after, 22 fighter jets and 11 helicopters were seen lined up near one of Sunan International Airport's main runways, likely to be flown over Pyongyang as part of the parade. And based on pictures from Sunday and Monday, there were crowds of people not described as military at Kim Il-sung Square, which is where the parade, if held, will take place on or around April 25th. This would appear to indicate that preparations are in their final stage. Voice of America describes the people in the square as holding red flowers and making formations. South Korea's military and intelligence officials are not ruling out the possibility of the parade being held at night. One informed source said Monday that North Korea could mobilize as many as 20,000 troops and a range of military equipment, including armored vehicles and transporter erector launchers used to fire missiles. The source noted the regime could even showcase its intercontinental and submarine-launched ballistic missiles. This came as the United States stationed the USS Alexandria, an attack submarine, in Yokosuka, Japan on Monday, not long after the USS Abraham Lincoln Carrier Strike Group conducted a naval exercise in the East Sea with Japan last week, amid growing concerns of North Korean provocations. Han Sung-woo, Arirang News.
Now it's time for Global Insight, where we speak to experts from around the world on issues making headlines. North Korea's latest test of new tactical guided weapons has triggered concern in Seoul, as the weapons could reach South Korea's largest cities. With a key state event around the corner and worrying developments at key nuclear development facilities detected, there's growing concern that the regime's actions could become more and more belligerent, emboldened by Russia's example in Ukraine and as a reaction to Seoul and Washington's ever stronger security alliance. Now we discuss what the regime might be scheming and how much threat it poses to South Korea and regional stability. For this, we connect with Robert Kelly, Professor of Political Science at Bucha National University, and Kim Yeon-wook, Professor and Director General at the Korea National Diplomatic Academy. Very warm welcome to you both. And well, let's start with you, Professor Kelly. Now, there is, of course, thank you for joining us. And well, there's concern growing in South Korea as the North, it claimed to launch what many believe it was were short-range missiles that could possibly target some of South Korea's largest cities. Now, what do you think these recent developments really tell us about North Korea's current nuclear doctrine?
Sure. I think the North Koreans have established direct deterrence with the United States mainland through the development in the past decade or so of sort of the big, heavy intercontinental ballistic missiles, right? And so that's really designed to sort of keep the Americans out or to try to wedge the Americans out of the Korean Peninsula, I think, over time. And now I think the North Koreans are sort of shifting to building smaller weapons that can actually be used here locally in the region. And there are really sort of, I think, two reasons for this. The most obvious is that the North Koreans are conventionally very far behind their local opponents. The North Korean military is very large, but it's fairly outdated, right? I mean, certainly compared to the militaries of South Korea, the United States, and Japan. And so nuclear weapons, smaller nuclear weapons on missiles that can be used locally are also valuable for the North Koreans just as a sort of military equalizer, right? And of course, they're beyond that, they're a great way to sort of bully and push South Korea into concessions and aid and things like that. So that's my read of that. They built the big ones first, and now they're moving to the smaller ones to use locally as like a bullying tool.
And I want to hear your thoughts on this, Professor Kim, as well. Your thoughts on North Korea's nuclear posture right now, and whether you think they would go as far as conducting a nuclear test, as some Washington officials have warned, around the 25th or in the near-term future.
I think a nuclear test is possible, but we'll see how it goes, because North Korea, I think, is trying to go its own way in developing its military capabilities. But I think they have to think about the domestic economic situations and also its relationship with China. Now, under the U.S.-China competition, I think North Korea is sticking to the Chinese side. So I think that there should be some kinds of discussions between China and North Korea about the situations in Northeast Asia. If North Korea tests nuclear weapons, I think this will be a burden to China. Of course, I think the Chinese position about the possible nuclear test of North Korea is that China would not cooperate in the UN Security Council. So I don't think this time, even when the North Korea tests nuclear weapons, UN Security Council additional sanctions would not be possible. But still, nuclear test of North Korea is a burden to China in the international community. So I think there should be some talks about these issues. But I think from the North Korean perspective, I think Kim Jong-un would just push for the nuclear test.
And Professor Kelly, I wonder how you see this. How do you think North Korea is actually perceiving this crisis in Ukraine right now? Do you think it's going to be motivated to take perhaps bolder action and count on China and Russia to veto any UN Security Council resolutions against it?
Sure. I think the North Koreans have sort of long since learned that China and Russia will carry water for it, if only because North Korea is a useful spoiler for China and Russia in the region. North Korea's sort of misbehavior, its hijinks, keep the Americans, the South Koreans, the Japanese, and others off balance in the region. They keep particularly the Americans from focusing on the South China Sea, which is what I think the Biden people would really like to do. But beyond that, I think the larger lesson, again, for the North Koreans from the Ukraine fight is that if you have the big nuclear weapons that I just talked about, if you have the intercontinental ballistic missiles, if you can directly threaten the Americans with nuclear escalation, or in the Ukrainian case, if you can threaten NATO with nuclear escalation, you can limit Western involvement. I mean, if I were North Korea, that's what I'd be learning. I mean, if the Biden people and NATO leaders and pundits across the West have said, we're not going to intervene in North Korea because, or in Ukraine because we fear Russian nuclear escalation. Putin's made that pretty clear. So if you're the North Koreans, I mean, that's the lesson that you're learning, right? Is that you can threaten the credibility of the U.S. alliance guarantee to South Korea by building these large weapons and threatening retaliation on the American homeland. That's the lesson I would be taking if I were the North Koreans.
And Professor Kim, well, the US's top North Korea envoy, Sung Kim, is of course here in Seoul, and he reiterated that the door is still open for dialogue towards the North. But all this time, Pyongyang has pretty much been ignoring that invitation to talk. And some believe that it's planning to scale up provocations before trying to negotiate some kind of sanctions relief. Would you agree with that analysis? What do you think their game plan is, really?
That was the traditional approach of North Korea to deal with the United States, escalating the military provocations and bring the United States to a talk with North Korea with the favorable conditions. But this time, I'm not sure if that will be really what North Korea wants, because even though the working level talk it begins, I don't think North Korea is capable of jumping into the working level talk with the United States, because a lot of processes are there, like declaring nuclear programs and getting inspected and got the verifications of what they have done in order to freeze and denuclearize. So that kind of process is something that Kim Jong-un cannot accept. That's why Kim Jong-un requested some preconditions like sanctions relief and stopping the joint military exercises, things like that. So I think what Kim Jong-un wants is to get all the preconditions and not serious about the working level talk itself. And I think that the United States knows that, Biden government knows that, and maybe North Korea under these circumstances is not really much interested in the working level talk. Kim Jong-un is just bolstering its relationship with China under the China-U.S. competitions. But we'll see how it goes. But I think for now, the possibility of working level talk between U.S. and North Korea is very low.
And how do you see this, Professor Kelly? Do you think North Korea is perhaps planning to increase its provocations to negotiate, or do you think there's little chance of dialogue?
Well, I don't think that there's much likelihood for dialogue. I mean, I think to be fair to the Biden people, I think they're genuinely interested, but I think that the Kim people expect a little bit more now that they got to meet Donald Trump. I mean, they actually got to meet the American president. They got the pictures. They got 3 of those meetings out of them. I think that really sort of elevated North Korea's sense of sort of its importance in world politics, and they're just not going to deal with U.S. envoys. They're not going to even talk to the American Secretary of State anymore. I think they want the whole thing. They want to actually talk to the American president. They want a real offer made by the American president, which Biden is not going to do, because I think he feels like that Trump was manipulated, which I think is correct. And so I think the North Koreans will continue to play the games that they have played with us for a while. They make all kinds of threats. Maybe there'll be a provocation, but it's all sort of a part of a larger package to kind of push the Americans and the South Koreans towards more concessions, towards, particularly sanctions relief is what they really want, right? And nuclear weapons are sort of a part of that, right? It's sort of part of this sort of tool to sort of bully and cajole and shove and threaten the U.S. and the South Koreans towards a concessions package.
And Professor Kim, well, I wonder how worried should South Korea, Japan and the US be at this point? Of course, South Korean Defense Minister Seoul told the South Korean National Assembly that Seoul is able to strike the North missile launch points. But do Seoul and Tokyo have sufficient radar and missile defense capabilities right now? Or do you think, as some insist, they should be pursuing their own nuclear deterrence?
Own nuclear deterrence of Japan and South Korea, I don't think that's possible, because there will be something that breaks the alliance system. If Japan and South Korea possesses nuclear weapons, there's no more need for the United States to provide a security guarantee to these allies, and 2 alliance systems would not be valid anymore. So that's what the U.S. is worrying about. That's why U.S. is not allowing these allies to possess these nuclear weapons. But I think what we are worrying about now is that North Korea is developing new strategical missiles that is very efficient in breaking and targeting the Seoul and Tokyo. which are not even defensible under the previous missile defense systems. So that's the problems. Those missiles are not something that is not easily capturable by radar systems and missile defense systems and LSAM and MSAMs that are the missile defense systems of South Korea. So these are the things that a South Korean defense minister mentioned about the preemptive strike. But preemptive strike itself is not realizable in reality either. So that's the dilemma we have now.
Professor Kelly, well, the US hasn't been too enthusiastic, of course, about redeploying tactical nuclear weapons to the South, which were retracted in 1991. But,
Right.
Well, then what is your opinion? What should be the approach to strengthening the Allies' deterrence?
Yeah, well, I think I would actually disagree with my esteemed colleague here. I actually think that Japanese and South Korean nuclearization is almost inevitable at this point. It's simply American extended deterrence, American extended nuclear deterrence to South Korea and Japan are simply not that credible if the North Koreans can strike the American homeland, right? I mean, the Americans are it's highly unlikely the Americans are going to exchange nuked cities in their own homeland in order to fight a nuclear conflict in Asia, which is what's inevitably going to drive Japanese and South Korean nuclearization. And this is why I'm kind of surprised the North Koreans are pushing this very hard. If you look at the Chinese have actually had a very restrained nuclear policy for decades, in part to prevent the counter-nuclearization by Japan and South Korea. And the North Koreans aren't doing that. The North Koreans are backing the South Koreans and the Japanese into a position where you've got Yoon talking in January about preemptive strikes on North Korea. You've got, right-wing newspapers in South Korea running, op-eds saying we should build our own nuclear weapons. Shinzo Abe, the former prime minister of Japan, is saying we need to bring American tactical weapons back to the region. I mean, the North Koreans are sort of boxing Korea and Japan into a spot where their other alternatives are all really terrible. Now, the best thing that we could do strategically would build missile defense, but missile defense doesn't work very well. I mean, this is missile defense is not really an out for this. Missile defense is probably 20 years behind in terms of its ability to actually shoot down serious numbers of inbounds coming in from North Korea. Maybe it can hit a few, but certainly not going to be able to absorb dozens and dozens the way that the North Koreans would probably deploy. So we're really kind of like in this tight spot. I mean, I wish we could negotiate with North Korea. I think that would be the best alternative, is to actually talk the North Koreans into some kind of arms control deal, something to get them back into the Non-Proliferation Treaty or get inspectors in there or something like that. But they had their big chance under Trump and Moon, and they didn't really offer very much. So, we're kind of stuck, which is why I think that nuclearization here is kind of inevitable at this point in the next decade or so.
Well, we seem stuck indeed, Professor Kelly. And, well, Professor Kelly, when Yoon takes office, it seems that deterrence will be the keyword, unlike incumbent President Moon's relentless pursuit for diplomacy with help from the likes of China and Russia. Now, learning from previous administrations, how should South Korea and the United States approach this North Korea threat?
Well, I think alliance reassurance is sort of the core issue, right? And also a willingness to sort of continue to beef up defense, particularly working on missile defense. I think that's a really, really important signal to send. Even if it doesn't work very well, we have to keep throwing money at that. I think Yoon's decision to bring THAAD back, to fill out the current battery and to perhaps install a second one, is a good idea. I think it would also be a good idea for South Korea to install more low-tier missile defense, the Patriot missile batteries particularly. I think the South Koreans should throw a great deal more money at Korean air and missile defense. I like the idea of building an aircraft carrier, which allows South Korean strike assets to be moved offshore. So there's a lot that can be done. But I don't think that we should just sort of militarily signal to the North Koreans, right? I think we should also really try to talk to them, and I hope that Yoon continues to do that. I think Moon went a little bit too far, but his predecessor, President Moon, went a little bit too far. But I hope that Yoon does the same thing, because, I mean, ultimately, if we don't talk our way into some kind of deal with North Korea, you're looking at an arms race. And I feel like that's where we're kind of stumbling. Even though nobody really wants it, we're kind of stumbling into that. And in 10 years, like I said, the region will be even more nuclearized than it is now.
And Professor Kim, your thoughts on this? What should Seoul and Washington's new policy towards Pyongyang be?
Well, I think, it would not be easy to bring North Korea into a table, because President-elect Yoon's policy towards North Korea is based upon mutuality. Which is that according to what North Korea denuclearizes itself, there will be a possible support from South Korea, which is something that is not acceptable by Kim Jong-un. So, and also for now, President-elect Yoon's policy priority is to strengthen the comprehensive strategic alliance, which means that alliance focus on regional area will be strengthened. So I think regional issues like Biden government's Indo-Pacific strategies, how to deal with the regional issues, how to deal with China issues. I think that will be the focal point for the U.S.-South Korea alliance, which means that North Korea issues, dealing with and talking with Kim Jong-un, that will be not the priority for U.S. and even for South Korea. What is more the priority for North Korea policy will be based upon sanctions and deterrence capabilities. So I don't think the possibility for Yoon government to deal with and to talk with Kim Jong-un would be not very high.
Well, I'm afraid we're out of time today, but that was Robert Kelly, Professor of Political Science at Busan National University, and Kim Yeon-uk, Professor and Director General at the Korea National Diplomatic Academy. Thank you both so much for your time today.
Thank you for having me.
Now, South Korea's producer price index, a key barometer of future inflation, hit a record high last month. The Bank of Korea says the producer price index in March stood at 116.46, up 1.3% from a month earlier. It's the third on-month rise in a row. Now, compared to a year earlier, the index was up nearly 9%, increasing for a 16th straight month. Now, the central bank attributes the rise to industrial goods, particularly coal and petroleum products, due to soaring global prices for oil and other raw materials. Now, yesterday, April 20th, was South Korea's Disabled Persons Day. Now, it's dedicated to raising awareness on what should be done to ensure the rights of this group. Well, our Shin Yeon went to find out the challenges they face and what must be done to provide better protection.
South Korea's public transport is well known for being quick and convenient. But it isn't quite as convenient for the 1 out of 20 Koreans who are disabled.
I'm using a wheelchair myself to go to a nearby subway station that's roughly 600 meters away from where I am right now. Now, it's my first time on one of these, so let's see how it goes. Now, I've arrived at the station, but as you can see, there's no way for me to go up. I would have to find a different entrance or exit with an elevator. And I've learned how inconvenient it is to use a wheelchair for even just a few minutes. I can't imagine how much disabled people have to go through having to use wheelchairs on a daily basis. That's why I went to find out what difficulties they face every day.
Pang Myung-hee has been paralyzed since she was just 11 months old. She's soon to turn 60 and needs a wheelchair to get around. And she says this hasn't been an easy task.
The front wheels of a wheelchair are very small. It's very dangerous whenever you're trying to get on the subway because there's a wide gap between the platform and boarding area, so the wheels can slip in. While electric wheelchairs have bigger wheels, they take up much more space. So when it's crowded on the subway, you can sense that other passengers are disturbed by your presence.
To put a spotlight on the issues facing people with disabilities, South Korea sets aside April 20th every year as the country's Disabled Persons Day and holds many nationwide events. To mark the day, the Seoul metropolitan government has decided to operate buses and taxis specialized for the disabled, free of charge. The country has also launched many rehabilitation centers to help the disabled keep fit and learn vocational skills. Seoul Community Rehabilitation Center was one of the first built in the country.
We provide customized rehabilitation and educational programs for the disabled and closely interact with the local community. Our centre poses an exemplary one-step model for other countries like Japan and Vietnam to use as a blueprint.
In just 40 years, South Korea has launched some 250 centers for the disabled, helping them live their lives and raising awareness of issues that they face. Shin Yeun, Arirang News.
Now, as the weather gets warmer, Changdeokgung Palace in the heart of Seoul is inviting visitors to its moonlit tour in the evening. Now, before its official opening on Thursday, our Lee Si-hoo went to get a sneak peek at the special tour and, not to mention, the secret garden at night.
Changdeokgung Palace, located in Seoul's Jongno-gu district, is the most well-preserved of all the royal palaces from the Joseon dynasty. And the palace has once again opened its doors for its nighttime tour, which has run in the spring and fall for the past 13 years.
We hope the visitors can feel as if they are the protagonists of the tour, like a king taking a stroll through the palace's rear garden alone at night.
The 100-minute guided tour starts off at Donhwamun, the main gate of the palace that only kings or high officials were allowed to enter through. Then the tour goes around the palace's halls, pavilions, and gardens. This year, for the first time ever, guests can enter Hyejeongdang, which has been reconstructed over the past 2 years. The hall is lit up with modern lights and elaborate chandeliers. Moving on towards Sangnyeongjong Pavilion, guests are welcomed by a traditional performance of a daegum, or a bamboo flute. After that, they reach the Huwon Rear Garden, also known as the Secret Garden. It is known for being cleverly adapted to the uneven landscape at the foot of a mountain. The buildings and pavilions of Changdeokgung Palace blend harmoniously with the surrounding landscape, following the contours of the land. For its harmony with the natural landscape, the palace was recognized as a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1997. At the garden, visitors can enjoy a performance of a Korean traditional string instrument, or komungo. Nearing the end of the tour, a traditional Korean fan dance at Yeongeongdang is the highlight of the evening. Visitors say the tour has opened their eyes to Korea's rich history and culture.
Honestly, it is just so beautiful. And I've just learned so much tonight, and it's opened my eyes to just how much culture, how much history there is behind the palace. And every room, every hall, every window has a history here.
The nighttime tour of the palace can be reserved online until June, but over 65s and the disabled can make reservations by phone. Lee Si-hoo, Arirang News.
For a look at the news from around the world, we now turn to our Matthew Ashley standing by at the Arirang newsroom. Very good morning to you.
Good morning to you guys.
Good morning to you, Matthew. Now let's kind of start things off over in the United States because a wildfire has forced thousands of residents in Arizona to flee their homes.
Well, that's right, SJ, and dubbed the Tunnel Fire, the blaze, which started on Sunday local time, has burned approximately 6,000 acres so far. Now, it has forced over 2,000 residents to leave their homes, as 24 buildings have already been damaged, while hundreds more are at risk. Officials said the fire is located 23 kilometers north of Flagstaff, Arizona, and is moving northeast. It comes amid an early start to the southern state's fire season, with dry grass and gusts of wind adding to the fire. 200 firefighters have been deployed to the area, while the National Weather Service has forecast wind speeds of up to 48 kilometers per hour for Wednesday and Thursday. Looking to India now, as the Indian Navy has launched its 6th and final domestically built Scorpene submarine. Named after a sandfish, the Vakshir was launched at the Mazagon Dock shipyard in Mumbai on Wednesday, following rituals and prayers. It's the final submarine to be constructed under Project 75, an Indian Navy program to build 6 diesel-powered Scorpene submarines, with technical assistance from France. According to a government press release, the vessels are able to engage in anti-surface and anti-submarine warfare lay mines, and conduct surveillance and intelligence gathering. The submarine will now be sent for sea trials before being delivered to the Indian Navy next year. Russian and Belarusian tennis players have been barred from Wimbledon. This is following Moscow's invasion of Ukraine. Wednesday's decision by the All England Lawn Tennis Club means men's world number 2 Daniil Medvedev and Russia and a women's number 4 Belarusian Aryna Sabalenka will not take part. Now, organizers said they had a responsibility to limit Russia's global influence. The governing bodies of men's and women's professional tennis called the move, quote, unfair, with the ATP saying the ban set a damaging precedent for the game. Wimbledon previously banned athletes based on nationality during World War II, when players from Germany and Japan were not allowed to compete. This year's event runs from June 27th to July 10th. Despite blackouts being a daily disruption in the Democratic Republic of Congo, Sister Alphonsine Ciza has found a homegrown solution. Now, the nun operates a micro-hydroelectric plant she built to overcome daily power cuts. Working alongside a team of nuns and engineers in the country's eastern town of Miti, the 55-year-old nun has managed to generate enough energy to power a convent, church, 2 schools and a clinic, all free of charge. Residents have said that without the power plant, the area would have no power at all for several hours every few days. Blackouts are a daily occurrence in the Democratic Republic of Congo, which uses a rundown hydroelectric power system to provide energy to its 90 million citizens.
Good morning. The risk of wildfire is rising with continued dry conditions. Mountainous regions in Gangwon-do, parts of Gyeongsang-do and Jeollado provinces are under a dry weather warning now. And the wind advisory could also be issued in the East Coast, the most concerning areas at risk of fire. White gaps and readings under mostly bright skies are on tap for Thursday, an average spring day across much of the country. Central regions and Jeollabuk-do province could see dusty air during the first half of the day, but air quality should improve as the day goes on. Morning temperatures are similar to slightly higher than yesterday morning in most parts. Highs in central regions will be similar to yesterday. The south will be slightly cooler today, though, and Jeju and the south coast will see spotty rain through the afternoon. Then on Friday, the capital and parts of Gangwon-do will see some sprinkles during the day. With that, here's a look at the weather conditions around the globe.
And that's going to wrap it up for our newscast this morning, but do stick around because we'll be back tomorrow for our Friday's edition of New Day at Arirang.
There will be updates throughout the day on Arirang, so please do tune in. But thank you as always for beginning your morning with New Day at Arirang. Have a lovely rest of the day wherever you are. Goodbye.